News of the Times. The Putney Mystery. The death of Ellen Matilda Franklin. In October of 1892, a young woman arrived quietly at a respectable house in Putney, and within 4 days she was dead. Her name was Ellen Matilda Franklin, 30 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts in good health only days earlier. Yet, when her death was registered, the medical certificate told a very neat story. Embolism, thrombosis, and chronic kidney disease. In short, natural causes. But something about the case didn't sit right. A month later, the Home Secretary ordered her body to be dug up from its grave in East Grinstead. What doctors discovered during the post-mortem would unravel that tiny explanation entirely and drag a surprising group of people into one of the most disturbing medical scandals of late Victorian London. A Putney doctor and his wife were arrested. An undertaker was accused of helping to conceal the truth, and the man suspected of performing the fatal operation, a doctor named Richard Freeman, had already vanished. What followed became known in the newspapers as the Putney Mystery, a story of secret medical practices, a falsified death certificate, and hurried burial, and a young woman whose death the authorities believed had been deliberately concealed. Tonight we look at that strange and troubling case of Ellen Matilda Franklin and the Victorian scandal that followed when her grave was opened. And in today's end of episode further particulars segment, our first brief curiosity from 1892 involves a religious sect known as the Peculiar People. Their view on universal love appears to have been interpreted somewhat enthusiastically, a situation which eventually brought one household's domestic arrangements to the attention of a rather puzzled magistrate. And finally, a small moment from a London inquest which began with a protest from one juror about the presence of another man on the panel and ended with a firm reminder from the coroner that justice under the British flag was not restricted by birthplace. So, sit back, make yourself comfortable, and prepare to be transported back to the year 1892 and to another remarkable case from the Victorian archives. In the autumn of 1892, Putney was a district in transition. Once a quiet riverside village on the southern edge of London, it had begun to swell with the steady spread of the capital. Rows of respectable brick houses lined newly laid streets, and middle-class families were increasingly drawn to its air of suburban gentility. Behind those respectable doors, however, Victorian life was often more complicated than appearances suggested. Doctors maintained private practices from their homes, midwives received patients discreetly, and women in difficulty, particularly those whose circumstances might not bear public scrutiny, sometimes travelled quietly across the city in search of medical assistance that could not be openly discussed. It was into this world that Ellen Matilda Franklin, a 30-year-old single woman, arrived in October of that year. Within days, she would be dead. At first, her death seemed straightforward enough. A medical certificate recorded that she had succumbed to embolism and heart disease, and her body was buried in the quiet Sussex town of East Grinstead. But something about the case soon began to trouble the authorities. Before long, the Home Secretary would order the exhumation of her body. What doctors discovered when the grave was opened would trigger one of the most disturbing medical scandals of late Victorian London. A case involving a doctor, his wife, an undertaker, and a missing medical man who had already vanished. Newspapers would soon call it the Putney Mystery. Ellen Matilda Franklin. To understand the case, it is necessary first to understand something of the woman at its centre. Ellen Matilda Franklin, known as Nellie, was about 30 years of age and for several years had been living in East Grinstead in Sussex in the house of Charles William Charwood, a builder and undertaker. The exact relationship was never formally defined, but evidence later suggested that Franklin had been under Charwood's protection for some time. During the 3.5 years she lived in his house, she had given birth to a child who tragically died in the summer of 1892 and was buried at East Grinstead. Franklin's life, like many working class women in Victorian England, had been unsettled. She had first gone into domestic service as a young woman and later moved between various employments and lodgings. And at one stage, she had been supported financially by a former employer who continued to send her money. By the autumn of 1892, however, Franklin had again fallen into difficulty. Evidence later presented in court suggested that she was 3 or 4 months pregnant. In early October, she travelled to visit her parents at Harlington in Middlesex, complaining of pains in her back and legs, but otherwise appearing cheerful and in reasonable health. Within a few days, she left again, telling her family that she intended to stay with friends. Instead, she travelled to Putney in South London. There, on the 7th of October, she arrived at the house of Dr. George Herbert Francis and his wife Amelia, a midwife, at 54 Chelverton Road. She did not come alone. Accompanying her was another doctor, Richard Thomas Freeman, a man who would soon disappear entirely from the story. And from that moment onwards, the events that unfolded inside the quiet Putney house would lead to one of the most troubling criminal trials of the Victorian medical world. From the St. James's Gazette, the 17th of November 1892, serious charge against a doctor and his wife. At the South Western Police Court yesterday, Dr. George Herbert Francis and his wife of Chelverton Road in Putney were charged with being concerned in causing the death of Ellen Matilda Franklin, aged 28, who is alleged to have died at the prisoner's house on October the 11th from the effects of an illegal operation. She died on the 11th and was buried at East Grinstead. Certain circumstances, however, arose, with the result that the body was exhumed and examined by 2 doctors, which led to the prisoners being arrested on the present charge. After hearing some evidence, Mr. Denham remanded the prisoners, refusing any application for bail. How did events unfold to put a doctor and his wife in court charged with the death of a young woman who had been in their care for an unnamed medical procedure? To answer this, we must go back to early October and a trip that seems to have been planned by Nellie herself and potentially sponsored by the man under whose care she had lived, Mr. Charleswood, undertaker. In the October of that year, Nellie Franklin travelled to London. On the evening of October the 7th, she was seen in the house of Dr. George Herbert Francis, a physician living at 54 Chelverton Road in Putney. With her was Dr. Richard Thomas Freeman, a medical practitioner who had rooms at Finsbury Circus in the city. The servants later recalled that Dr. Freeman had arrived carrying a small leather bag. The visitors were shown into a room where a couch stood, and it was believed that this was there that the events began which would later come under such close scrutiny. What precisely occurred in that room was never fully witnessed by others, but the prosecution would later allege that an illegal operation had been performed upon Nellie Franklin, a procedure carried out in secret and one that would ultimately prove fatal. Afterwards, the woman was taken upstairs and placed in a bedroom, and for several days she remained in the house. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. By the morning of October the 11th, it was clear that she was gravely ill. A servant was sent to fetch a neighbouring doctor, and when he arrived, he was met at the door by Mrs. Amelia Eunice Francis, the wife of the physician. She informed him that the woman was already dead. The explanations that followed seemed straightforward enough. Dr. Freeman stated that the deceased had been suffering from heart disease and that her death had resulted from natural causes. A medical certificate was produced. It stated that the cause of death was embolism, resulting from thrombosis, conditions which were said to have developed over time. The certificate bore the name of Dr. Richard Thomas Freeman together with the counter-signature of Dr. Francis. The document was accepted and the machinery of burial proceeded. Later that same day, an undertaker named Samuel Foster, who lived nearby, was summoned. Instructions were given for the preparation of a coffin, and on the evening of October the 13th, the coffin was brought to the house. The body was placed inside in the presence of Dr. and Mrs. Francis. Afterwards, the undertaker and his men were provided with refreshments downstairs before leaving the house. The following day, Charles Charlwood called upon the mother of the deceased in East Grinstead. He brought with him a letter purportedly written by Dr. Freeman, which explained that her daughter had died suddenly from heart disease. Arrangements were made for burial. On October the 18th, Ellen Matilda Franklin was laid to rest in East Grinstead Cemetery. For a time, the matter appeared to be concluded, but suspicion soon began to grow. Certain details surrounding the death certificate did not sit comfortably with those who examined it. Questions were raised about the medical evidence and the circumstances in which the woman had died. The matter was brought to the attention of the authorities. On the instructions of the Home Secretary, an order was issued for the exhumation of the body. From the Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, the 27th of November, 1892, the Putney mystery. Mr. G. E. Hillman, coroner for Sussex, resumed the inquiry at the courthouse in East Grinstead on Tuesday into the death of Ellen Matilda Franklin, a single woman, 30 years of age, who died at Putney on October the 11th and was buried at East Grinstead Cemetery. Subsequently, the Home Secretary ordered the exhumation of the body, and Mr. and Mrs. Francis were arrested on suspicion of causing the woman's death at their residence, 54 Chelverton Road in Putney. Much interest was manifested in the proceedings, the deceased having lived for 3 or 4 years at the house of Mr. Charlwood, a builder and contractor of East Grinstead. Dr. and Mrs. Francis were present at the inquest, being brought from Holloway Prison in the custody of a warder. Mrs. Amelia Grafton, widow and registrar of births and deaths for the Putney sub-district, deposed that on Thursday, October the 13th, Mrs. Francis brought to the office a certificate of the death of Ellen Matilda Franklin, dated the previous day. Witness asked if Mrs. Francis was the friend of the deceased, and the reply was no, her friend was not here. She came to Putney to be nursed and to be near her own doctor. Mr. Bodkin read the certificate, which set out that the primary cause of death was embolism, its duration having been 5 hours. The secondary cause were thrombosis and chronic Bright's disease of the kidneys, duration 1 year and 8 months. When the grave was opened, the case took a far darker turn. The post-mortem examination was carried out by Mr. Thomas Bond, lecturer in forensic medicine at Westminster Hospital, together with Dr. Wallace of East Grinstead. Bond was a highly respected figure in Victorian forensic medicine, known for his careful and methodical approach to medical investigation. The findings of the examination were unequivocal. The injuries discovered during the post-mortem demonstrated that a violent and unlawful operation had been performed upon the deceased. The condition of the internal organs showed no evidence of the natural causes stated on the certificate. There was no trace of embolism and no indication of the disease that had supposedly claimed her life. Instead, the examination revealed that the woman had died from shock and severe loss of blood, the result of injuries inflicted only hours before her death. The conclusion was unavoidable. The medical certificate was false. One reason the case became such a sensation was the testimony of the famous Thomas Bond, who had been involved in the Ripper cases some years before. Thomas Bond was one of the most experienced forensic surgeons in London during the late Victorian period. A Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, he served as a lecturer in forensic medicine at Westminster Hospital and frequently assisted the authorities in difficult medico-legal investigations. Bond had considerable experience in post-mortem examination and was often called upon when a death required careful medical interpretation. His work had become well known when he assisted the Metropolitan Police during the Whitechapel murders of 1888, providing one of the earliest psychological assessments of the killer believed to be Jack the Ripper. By the early 1890s, his opinion in suspicious death cases carried significant weight with both coroner and the courts. From the Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, the 27th of November, 1892, The Putney Mystery. Mr. Thomas Bond, lecturer on forensic medicine at Westminster Hospital, described the results of the post-mortem examination which he conducted at East Grinstead on the 15th inst, in conjunction with Dr. Wallace, Mr. Charlwood, and Police Superintendent Berry being also present. He was of the opinion that the cause of death was shock and loss of blood following an illegal operation. Great force must have been used, and the injuries were necessarily fatal. The statement as to the cause of death in the medical certificate was absolutely untrue. The injuries were inflicted certainly not more than a few days before death, and possibly only a few hours. As the inquest continued, more evidence was put forward by Ellen's mother, as well as a servant within the household and the undertaker assigned to the burial of Ellen. Mrs. Franklin, the deceased woman's mother, stated that Ellen had lived for 3.5 years at the house of Charles William Charlwood in East Grinstead, during which time she had been supported financially by a former employer who had paid the expenses connected with her first confinement. In early October, she told her mother she intended to consult Dr. Freeman regarding swollen ankles, and afterwards planned to stay with the acquaintances of Charlwood in Putney. On learning of her daughter's death, Mrs. Franklin authorised Charlwood to conduct the funeral arrangements. Mrs. Harriet Pattenden, a servant in the household of Dr. and Mrs. Francis, said that she understood that women sometimes came to the house to be confined. On the 7th of October, Dr. Freeman arrived with the deceased, whose Pattenden believed to be Mrs. Charlwood. They were shown into the dining room, and later the woman was confined to bed upstairs. Dr. Freeman visited again as her condition worsened. Pattenden was eventually sent to fetch Mr. Barry of Putney, but on her return she was told the woman had died. Charlwood called at the house the following day. Samuel Foster, an undertaker of Putney, testified that he was instructed by Mrs. Francis to prepare the coffin, being told the woman had died of heart disease. Charlwood was present when these arrangements were made. From the Evening News in London, the 3rd of December 1892, the Putney mystery. Dr. Francis and his wife and Charlwood charged with wilful murder, a damning narrative. The performance of illegal operation and the flight of Freeman. Dr. Francis and his wife Amelia Francis appeared before Mr. G.I. Denham at the South Western Police Court today on remand, charged with the wilful murder of Nellie Franklin by an illegal operation. C.W. Charlwood was also charged with being an accessory before the fact. Mr. Bodkin briefly addressed the magistrate and said that in addition to the charges of wilful murder against the prisoner, he proposed to bring against Charlwood the charge of making certain false statements in a certificate of death with references to the death of the deceased. The story of the crime was as follows. Ellen, Nellie Matilda Franklin, had lived for about 3 years with Charles William Charlwood in East Grinstead, where her young son, who later died, had already been buried by Charlwood. In late September 1892, she travelled to visit her mother at Harlington, complaining of pains in her leg and her back. Evidence suggested that she was then 3 or 4 months pregnant, and after leaving her mother, she said that she was going to stay with friends in Putney. On the 7th of October, she was seen in the company of Dr. Richard Freeman, who had chambers at 2 Finsbury Circus. Around this time, Freeman cashed a cheque for £10, drawn by Charlwood. 2 days later, Franklin visited the house of Dr. and Mrs. Francis in Chelverton Road in Putney, accompanied by Freeman. It was alleged that an illegal operation was first performed there, after which Franklin remained in the house, became increasingly ill, and eventually died following what appeared to be a miscarriage. Mrs. Francis was a woman who advertised under the initials F.L. in the newspapers that she would take in women to be confined in her house. There was no doubt that both she and Francis were aware of the condition of the deceased. The prosecution case continued. On the night of the 11th of October, an attendant, Mrs. Goddard, was informed that the woman had suffered a severe miscarriage. Mrs. Francis then sent for Dr. Francis and also summoned Dr. Barry of Putney. When Dr. Barry arrived, he was met by Dr. Francis, who told him that the woman was already dead. Afterwards, another attendant was dismissed to bed, and Dr. Francis stated that the woman had died not from miscarriage, but from heart disease, a claim later reflected in the medical certificate. The following morning, Mrs. Goddard was sent to telegraph Charlwood, and later that day, both Freeman and Charlwood came to the house. A coffin was afterwards obtained, and it contained not only the body of the woman, but something which had been packaged between the legs of the woman. Charlwood called at Francis's house afterwards, and then went to Mr. Foster's, giving orders that the coffin should be taken down to East Grinstead, but by road. The evidence at the inquest caused a profound sensation. The discovery inside the coffin, reported cautiously but unmistakably in newspapers across the country, confirmed the darkest suspicions of the investigators. The press, bound by the conventions of the time, avoided explicit description, yet the implication was clear enough to every reader. Something had been placed between the legs of the unfortunate Ellen Franklin before the coffin was sealed. The evidence strongly suggested that it was connected to the unlawful operation believed to have caused her death, the physical remains of the desperate procedure itself. For Victorian readers, the horrors required little elaboration. The details were left largely unspoken, but the meaning was plain. The burial of Ellen Franklin had concealed not merely a death, but evidence of the act that had led to it. And once that discovery was made, the case would no longer remain quietly buried in East Grinstead Cemetery. From the Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, the 4th of December 1892, verdict of wilful murder. The inquiry into the circumstances attending the death of Ellen Matilda Franklin, who died under suspicious circumstances at 54 Chelverton Road in Putney, and whose body was exhumed after burial in East Grinstead Cemetery, was resumed at East Grinstead Court House on Wednesday. Some further evidence having been given, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against Alice Francis, wife of Dr. Francis, Dr. Richard W. Freeman, and C. W. Charwood. They found that Dr. Francis was an accessory after the fact only. They found that the cause of death was as stated in the medical testimony. The coroner to Mrs. Francis: "You have been found guilty by the jury of the crime of wilful murder in conjunction with Dr. Freeman and Charwood, and it is my duty to commit you for trial at the next session of the Central Criminal Court." Addressing Charwood, the coroner said, "You have been found guilty on this charge, and I have given you into custody." Inspector Pugsley then arrested Charwood and conveyed him to Wandsworth. Dr. and Mrs. Francis being taken back to Holloway Jail. Dr. Freeman had disappeared. While the accused now sat in jail awaiting trial, the investigation continued to unravel the sequence of events that had led to Nellie Franklin's death. Two particularly troubling facts emerged. The first concerned a cheque for £10 drawn by Charwood and cashed by Dr. Richard Freeman at a restaurant in London Wall on the 8th of October, only days before Nellie arrived at the house in Chelverton Road. In modern terms, that sum would amount to roughly £1,500 to £1,700, a not insignificant payment. Prosecutors suggested that this money represented the fee for the unlawful operation believed to have been performed on the young woman. The second discovery concerned the preparation of the coffin. On the evening of the 13th of October, an undertaker named Foster was called to the house to measure the body and prepare the coffin. Nellie's remains were placed inside the presence of Dr. and Mrs. Francis, and at that point, however, the undertaker and his assistants were asked to leave the room briefly and go downstairs for refreshments. When they returned, nothing outwardly appeared to have changed. Yet investigators later concluded that it was during this short absence that something had been placed inside the coffin, a concealed parcel, between the legs of the dead woman. The newspapers of the day spoke cautiously of the matter, but the inference was unmistakable. The remains of the fatal operation had been hidden there before the coffin was sealed, and the body quietly conveyed by road to East Grinstead for burial. It was a grim detail, and one that would become central to the prosecution case when the matter finally reached the Old Bailey. Further investigations in the residences of all the principals in the case found further evidence. At the house of Francis were found a number of drugs which Dr. Bond would say were illicitly used for improper purposes. At the house of Dr. Freeman were also found 15 instruments. The appearances at the post-mortem showed that terrible injuries had been inflicted on the woman. This point was stressed, although the papers avoided graphic descriptions. From the Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, the 18th of December, 1892, the Putney Mystery. Mr. Denman at the South Western Police Court on Friday resumed the magisterial investigation on the charges against Dr. and Mrs. Francis of 54 Chelverton Road in Putney and Charles William Chartwood, builder and undertaker of East Grinstead, of being concerned in causing the death of Ellen Matilda Franklin, a single woman, by an illegal operation. Samuel Foster, undertaker of Hereford Cottage in Putney, examined by Mr. Bodkin, said that on the October the 12th he went to 54 Chelverton Road, and there he saw Mrs. Francis, who asked him to make a coffin for a lady who had died suddenly of heart disease. Charwood was in the room with Mrs. Francis and asked if he should take the rings, money and purse. The purse of the deceased was taken out of a dress in the wardrobe and given to Charwood. On the following evening, he and 3 of his assistants took the coffin to the room where the body lay. Mr. and Mrs. Francis were in the room. The body was put into the coffin in the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Francis. As soon as the side slips were turned over the body and before the lid was put on the coffin, Mrs. Francis said, "Will you go downstairs and have some refreshments? A lady friend wishes to see the body." He and his assistants went down to the dining room and stayed there 4 or 5 minutes. Mr. and Mrs. Francis remained in the room with the body, and when he returned, the coffin seems to have been precisely in the same condition as when he left it. After fastening down the lid of the coffin, he had carried it at Mrs. Francis' request to his office. It remained there until the following Friday, when Charwood called. Charwood had with him a black leather bag, which witness believed he had seen in the wardrobe in the room where the deceased had laid. Charwood made arrangements for the conveyance of the coffin to Grinstead, saying that it would be cheaper to go by road. His charges, £2.15, were paid by Charwood by cheque, and on Saturday morning a van came and the coffin was carried to East Grinstead. From the Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, the 25th of December, 1892, the Putney Mystery. Mr. Denman proceeded on Saturday at the South Western Police Court with the charge against Dr. George Herbert Francis, Miss Isamelia Annis Francis, his wife, and Charles William Charwood, an undertaker of East Grinstead, of being concerned in the wilful murder of Ellen Matilda Franklin, a single woman, 30 years of age, who died on October the 11th at the residence of Dr. Francis, 54 Chelverton Road in Putney, and was buried at East Grinstead Cemetery, her body being exhumed a month later by order of the Home Secretary. Mr. Richard Hose, dental surgeon of 2 Finsbury Circus, deposed that Dr. Freeman occupied rooms in the same building. He had seen Dr. and Mrs. Francis there together on 2 or 3 occasions. The death certificate was handed to the witness, who perused it and expressed his belief that the body of the certificate and the signature of Freeman were in the handwriting of Dr. Freeman. Mr. T.H. Gurin, an expert in handwriting of Holborn, provided that the signature of Dr. Francis, his address and qualification were in the handwriting of Dr. Francis. As the investigation deepened and the disturbing details of the case spread through the newspapers, public fascination grew rapidly. The Putney Mystery, as it soon became known, captured the imagination of readers across the country. Each fresh revelation seemed darker than the last, and the authorities were determined that no possible thread of guilt should go unexplored. With the accused now awaiting trial, the prosecution began assembling its case in earnest, and it was a sweeping one. Indeed, prosecutors sought to place before the court not only the events that led directly to Nellie Franklin's death, but also evidence suggesting that this tragedy might not have been an isolated incident. As a result, a further charge was brought forward alleging that the accused had previously conspired with Dr. Richard Freeman to procure an abortion upon the same woman in May of 1891 at Tunbridge Wells. It was a serious allegation, one that suggested a troubling history behind the fatal events at Putney, and one that would soon be examined in detail when the case finally came before the Old Bailey. When the case finally came before the Old Bailey in January 1893, the prosecution laid out what it described as a carefully arranged conspiracy that had led to the death of Ellen Matilda Franklin. Three people stood in dock. Amelia Ansis Francis, the midwife, whose Putney house had received the young woman; Charles William Charlwood, the East Grinstead builder and undertaker with whom she had long been associated; and George Herbert Francis, Amelia's husband, charged not with the killing itself, but with helping to conceal the crime afterwards. The man believed to have carried out the fatal operation, Dr. Richard Freeman, was notably absent. He had disappeared months earlier and remains at large. Over several days before the jury heard how Ellen Franklin, pregnant and vulnerable, had been taken to the Francis' household in Chelverton Road, where an unlawful operation was alleged to have been performed. Servants described her arrival with Dr. Freeman, her rapid decline, and the claim made afterwards that she had died from heart disease. Medical testimony would later prove that explanation false. Witnesses described how the body was placed in a coffin while Dr. and Mrs. Francis remained alone in the room for a short time, after which the coffin was sealed and sent to East Grinstead for burial. The death certificate, signed in Freeman's name and countersigned by Francis, attributed the death to embolism and kidney disease, causes which the prosecution insisted were entirely fictitious. The most decisive evidence came from Dr. Thomas Bond of Westminster Hospital, who had examined the exhumed body, and his post-mortem revealed no natural cause of death. Instead, he told the court, the injuries he observed showed unmistakably that the woman had undergone an unlawful and violent operation, and that death had followed from the shock and loss of blood. The prosecution's case was therefore stark, that the procedure had been carried out by Freeman and Mrs. Francis, arranged and financed by Charlwood, and that afterwards the true case and cause of death had been deliberately concealed. After days of testimony and argument, the fate of the accused was placed in the hands of the jury. From the Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, the 22nd of January 1893. Putney Mystery, Verdict and Sentences. The judge, who commenced summing up at 5 o'clock, said the case was one of the most important he had ever had to try, and in proceeding to deal with the facts, expressed regret that Dr. Freeman was not in the dock with the other prisoners. He said that the fatal evidence against Charlwood was the payment of the cheque for £10 to Freeman, who, had he been an honest and innocent man, would have been present to explain what happened. Little doubt could be entertained as to the object for which the cheque was given. If they were satisfied that an illegal action was performed, that Charlwood was partly to it, then they ought to say so and to convict him of the offence of murder or manslaughter. As to the woman Francis, her conduct might have a suspicious bearing, but the jury should dismiss this from their minds. They had to be determined if she acted with guilty knowledge. His lordship dealt with the facts of the case as they reflected on the action of the woman and of her husband, the prisoner Francis. As to him, they had to determine if he did anything after the deed which was criminal. The jury retired to consider the verdict at 7 o'clock, and after an absence of half an hour, they returned a verdict of manslaughter against Charlwood and Mrs. Francis. Herbert Francis was convicted as an accessory after the fact to the manslaughter. Mr. Justice Grantham observed that Freeman had been tried for unlawfully administering drugs with an intent to commit a felony. No sympathy could be held for him. Charlwood. He sentenced him for 5 years penal servitude, Mrs. Francis to 3 years penal servitude, and the male prisoner Francis was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. And so the Putney mystery, which had gripped newspapers, courtrooms and drawing rooms across the country for months, finally reached its legal conclusion. Yet the central figure in the tragedy, Dr. Richard Freeman, never stood before the court to answer the charges laid against him. The man whom the prosecution believed had carried out the fatal operation had simply vanished, leaving the others to face the consequences of a crime whose full story could never be completely told. For Ellen Matilda Franklin, the young woman at the centre of it all, the proceedings could offer no real justice. Her life had been shaped by the precarious circumstances faced by many women of the Victorian era: limited independence, fragile respectability, and the constant danger that a single mistake might place them beyond the protection of society. Cases such as this also exposed the darker reality of the time. Long before safe medical procedures or legal protections existed, desperate women often turned to clandestine arrangements that were as dangerous as they were secretive. When such interventions went wrong, the consequences could be fatal, and the truth frequently buried alongside the victim. The Putney case became one of the most widely reported examples of that grim reality. It revealed not only the risks of illicit medical practice, but also the complicated web of relationships, money, secrecy, and other social pressures that surrounded it. In the end, the court delivered its verdict, but the full truth of what happened in that quiet house in Chelverton Road in Putney on the night of the 11th of October 1892 would remain partly obscured, carried away with the one man who never returned to face the law. Further particulars. Before we leave the year 1892 behind entirely, the newspapers offer us one of those small social curiosities which remind us that Victorian Britain could be just as bewildering as it was respectable. Our next item comes from the Illustrated Police News and concerns a religious sect known as the Peculiar People. Their interpretation of Christian fellowship appears to have been rather more enthusiastic than the magistrates of Stratford were prepared to tolerate. The result was a domestic dispute, a somewhat unconventional definition of neighbourly affection, and a labourer who ultimately found himself explaining matters to a bench of magistrates with consequences that were considerably less affectionate. Finally, a brief moment from an inquest held at Poplar Town Hall, one which offers a revealing glimpse of the attitudes and occasionally the decency of late Victorian public life. During the proceedings, one juror objected loudly to the presence of another man on the panel, not because of anything he had done, but simply because of who he was. What followed was a quiet but very firm response from both the coroner who had presided over the Ripper victim inquests, no less, and the rest of the jury. A reminder that even in 1890s, common sense and fairness could sometimes prevail in a public room. From the Illustrated Police News, the 9th of January 1892, Peculiar People and Free Love. At the Stratford Petty Sessions on Saturday, George Carter, a labourer of Great Wakering near Southend, appeared to an adjourned summons charging him with the neglecting to support his wife and child and 3 stepchildren, whereby they became chargeable to the funds of the West Ham Union. The case has become notorious owing to the fact that the prisoner's wife admitted that she was a member of the peculiar people and thought it her duty to love everybody. She also said that it was true a lodger, also a member of the same society, had sat upon her knees and she upon his, and that she had kissed him, and that it was only in accordance with the principles of the society. The defendant said he was not the master of the house and was really turned out. He objected to the lodger, but it was of no use. His wife would have him there. The magistrate said that he, the defendant, had a duty to perform to support his wife and children. He had failed and had not substantiated his complaints. He committed him to prison for 1 month with hard labour. A Negro juror. Mr. Wynne E. Baxter on Saturday held an inquest at the Poplar Town Hall on a man who had died suddenly. On the opening of the proceedings, one of the jurors pointed to a Negro and said, "Mr. Coroner, I protest against that man sitting on the jury. He is not a native of this country." The coroner said, "I think it quite likely he will do justice to the case as well as any other man on the jury. Hear, hear." The juror, "Well, I protest against his sitting as a juryman." The foreman of the jury said, "He's under the British flag and can fulfill the duties of a British subject, and he has a right to sit. Hear, hear." The first juror, "No, he has not. I protest." The Negro, "I have been in England 16 years and was married in this country. I'm not sitting here from choice, but of necessity." The foreman, "I appeal to my brother juryman if our friend is to be insulted." The coroner, "He will not be insulted here. He has done his duty, which is more than the others have." The coloured gentleman then assisted the 11 other jurymen to return an appropriate verdict. The coroner, in discharging the jury, particularly thanked the Negro for his services. And with that, the clock has finally run down on tonight's tale. If you listen carefully, you might also hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway striking midnight, the signal, perhaps, that other curious chapters of history have been closed for the night. Before we put away the newspapers and extinguish the lamps, we would like to offer our sincere thanks to all of you who have visited over the years and spent time with us among the murders, mysteries and misadventures of the Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian age. Your curiosity, your comments and your company have been very much appreciated. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, a man whose hobbies included reading very old newspapers long past their bedtime, mistrusting suspicious puddings, and maintaining a respectful distance from Victorian medical practitioners carrying leather bags. Until we meet again, we wish you peace, kindness and goodwill, and if possible, a life entirely free of coroners, suspicious telegrams and hurriedly issued deaths. Good night.